Thank you, Dr. Lee. The last little bit of this is time for a bit of discussion among the committee members and a little bit about what we're going to do tomorrow. Let me take Chair's prerogative and start the discussion with what has been mentioned several times this afternoon, and that's the new primer, I guess, depending on what part of the country you're from. For clinical practitioners, how many in the committee have been able to see this? This is just for the few people that might not know this. It's just been recently released. It's not something that's been around for very long. How many people have had a chance to actually read it? Okay, so I know you guys have. Somehow I'm not surprised to see all those hands out there.
And it was Nancy's decision to put it in there.
Yeah. First of all, to thank Nancy Lee for making the decision to actually put this in so that we could take a look at it, those that have not seen it yet. For those of you that have read it, how about some brief comments of what you see as the strengths? Do you see any particular shortcomings in it, any challenges with it, et cetera? Recognizing that, and I talked to Lenny when they were close to seeing this, and I saw an early copy of it, and the authors, just so that you know, that we all know, the authors do not hold this out as the final discourse. They hold this out as the latest chapter in the dialogue and the progress in understanding, helping clinicians to understand how to better care for this. Let me start just for a second, just again, for the clinicians that are taking care of ME/CSF patients. It doesn't have to be just physicians. If you're also doing it, taking care of them in any aspect. And then, Steve, I want to get your perspective as the one that represents and advocates for them in court, and just try to be methodical about this. Susan, I know that you've read it. Give us some of your thoughts. Use your mic.
Yeah, I think obviously it's very well put together. It's both, covers the complexity of the illness, but I think is succinct enough so that people won't be put off by, enormously didactic type of document. And I think it offers some good solutions in terms of, what some medications are that offer symptomatic relief in many patients. And I think actually one of the most useful things is in the back where you have like a worksheet. And I'm now involved in several clinical studies where I find these sort of worksheets helpful in terms of checking off what clinical symptoms are relevant and whether, whether the patient meets the Fukuda criteria, the Canadian criteria. I think the pediatric worksheet is very helpful. And overall, I think it's quite good as a kind of a starting document. I think it could use some refinements, but I think it's very good.
Okay, we'll come back to that in a minute. Jordan?
I haven't had a chance to look at it. I'm sorry.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. I thought I saw your hand up. I apologize. Dane?
I think the openness to the evolvingness of the document is a strength of it, and they're very upfront. And I think for the most part it's quite balanced. I think it is with a few exceptions, very careful in its approach to the pathophysiology, the treatment, and I think that's a strength of the document, again with a few exceptions.
A little bit disappointed because there's people around the world that have been working for several years on biomarkers for chronic fatigue, and there's just not a single one here.
Well, they do reference your 2010 paper.
In their tests to be considered depending on symptoms, there's only immunoglobulins, which really won't help you at all. There's morning cholesterol night. The rheumatoid factor would be something that should be done to eliminate another disease. On the table 1, we find a marker for inflammation C-reactive protein, which is probably the most non-specific analyte that could be looked at. It's elevated in almost everything. So I just hope at some time or other a working group will begin to include some of the things that we have shown to be objectively different in chronic fatigue compared to controls.
To respond to you on behalf of Dr. Jason, I asked that very question of him when I saw an early draft of this, and his basic response was the consensus among the group in this is that those biomarkers are research tools, and that this is a tool that they're trying to use for clinicians to bring them up to speed. They did not intentionally, at least, eliminate the work that's been done. They're not easily available. I can tell you, ask the clinicians around the table, how easy is it for you to get a serum IL-5 level? Can you get a serum neuropeptide Y level? You can't get those clinically. So their intent, oh, of course. Post-paid or postage due? I'm just checking. We got you on camera here now, so be careful. I think the intent was to separate what I think most people do agree, and I agree with you. CRP is not my favorite biomarker either, but it is one that has extensive, as you well know, has extensive use and application in clinical inflammatory diseases. So that was their intent, and I think part of the refinement will be to give them that feedback. And I use the old argument, there are a lot of tests that there was a time, I think you and I are senior enough to remember when C-reactive protein was really still a research test. And what they had were the old Wintrobe sedimentation rates, and that's what they used for inflammation. And now, well, yeah, it's still there, but CRP, which is now can be done, high profile, high sensitivity CRPs for various diseases and correlated. It was their intent to use clinically available, shall we say, stuff for the clinicians and not to, and I guess this sounds like I'm being disdainful toward clinicians, and I'm certainly not, and I didn't take it that way when it was told to me, not to confuse the issue with research information that could not be ordered. There are a lot of, just for the non-clinicians, there are a lot of illnesses now where gene mutations are actually defined biomarkers, but there are only certain institutions that you can get them done because many of the commercial labs don't do them. So if you don't know, Marianne, the chance of getting a neuropeptide Y level done on these people is less because you have to find somebody who can run it, and then you have to know that they know how to run it. No one would question that Dr. Fletcher's lab doesn't know how to run it, but it's one lab out of, and I, all kidding aside, I think she can only accept so many pro bono samples to be run, unless of course.
Yeah, the university wouldn't like it if
Yeah.
they did. You mentioned gene expression, and I really have my hopes bound up in that. I think that's a real possibility.
I think many of us do. We just have to bring the clinical pathologist along. They have a pediatric geneticist who screens all the gene expression and gene mutation study requests for our entire campus because, we work on a state campus where less than half of the patients have any money for reimbursement. So the hospital pays for these things, and they're $1,000 to $3,000 a pop. So part of this is just the logistics. And again, the way I interpreted listening to what Lenny told me was that the intent here was to show what clinicians right now would be able to do if they wanted to evaluate, not to exclude anybody. Jordan.
Just to jump in on the discussion about the gene expression, I think we don't want to probably turn it into a discussion entirely about that, but I think what you meant is that there are really tests which look at genetic variations, most probably SNP variations like single nucleotide polymorphisms, and I think there is one which is clinically reimbursable for monitoring warfarin levels and the response to warfarin. But I think it really is the future of probably looking at diseases like chronic fatigue syndrome. And I think part of the problem really lies in the fact that the prices are going down, but we still don't have information enough about what's normal and what's abnormal. So here's a suggestion. I actually knew a geneticist once who had this idea about how you define the normal and the abnormal. And he had this interesting idea about anyone walking into a hospital spitting into a cup, and then you get their DNA, and you can get the DNA from saliva, and you can save it somewhere, and you can create this huge data bank, because I think we're probably getting to a point where we'll have, as we heard, a lot of samples from people with chronic fatigue syndrome, ME, who are very well characterized, but then we'll end up in a situation where we'll probably need to know what is the normal, what is the abnormal, and I think we still need to think ahead and be prepared for that time.
Absolutely. Oh, by the way, I should say, while we're saying this, one of the audience pointed out to me that when I talk too fast, I say CSF and not CFS. So CSF is cerebrospinal fluid, CFS is chronic fatigue syndrome. So that's another reason why I'll be glad when they get rid of that name, because I can't talk straight. So I'm good with that too. Steve, what do you think?
I think you should put an ME in front of it and you'll be fine.
But I'd say it doesn't matter. No, I wish it would. I still butcher it. It doesn't really matter.
The primer is really, I think, helpful to somebody who really knows nothing about it. And it gives the worksheets, it talks about lab tests, and most importantly, it gives a differential diagnosis. So the other things you should think about that could cause the fatigue, which makes it something, I mean, as an attorney who's done medical malpractice cases, if somebody doesn't follow this, they've screwed up and they're potentially exposed. And I just think it's a good start, and it's a document that's going to be evolutionary. And we talked to Ermias after I kind of pilloried him up there, and I'm sorry about that. But in reality, why invent a toolkit when you've got a primer? And why not connect to the primer if the IACFS would let you do that, and put information that's very current and very useful? So those are my thoughts. Oh, and they also talk about precipitating factors, of which they include physical trauma. And that's a first. I didn't notice that.
Well, this comes close to what many different disciplines identify as practice parameters for existing illnesses. And the issue, though, is that those are usually put out by a professional clinical organization. And as of yet, we don't have a clinical organization for MECFS.
Yeah, well, that's because it didn't grow up in any particular, I mean, it started in the infectious disease community.
And then it went to the immunology community,
and
then
it
went
got
to
lost.
Yeah. Right.
Whereas you look at the history of something like fibromyalgia, it grew up and stayed in the rheumatology community.
Right.
The criteria were designed by a group of rheumatologists, got together and said, we got to study this. To study this, we have to agree on what it is. So they came up with criteria.
Well, if we, that's an interesting point of discussion for this committee to discuss, interesting point of discussion to discuss. We should talk about it a little bit from the standpoint of, is this a primary care or a specialty disease? And I think that the fact is, and it was suggested to me earlier today, and I'd like to throw this out, and I'll get to you just one second. I hadn't forgotten you. But the idea of, you know what, I've been on this committee now for a little over 2 years, and I went back to look at the old records and so on, and I can't remember us ever, as a committee, inviting anyone from the American Academy of Family Practice, American College of Physicians, American Academy of Pediatrics, the primary care, and I would put in that the American College of Obstetrics and Gynecology. Is that right? ACOG? That's right. The primary care specialties, and they do recognize themselves as primary specialists for women. I don't think we've ever invited anyone there. The president of the organization, let us tell you about this. Let us teach you about this. This thing, in my view, after having read it now in the forum, this thing ought to be sent out to the presidents of all those individuals, organizations, for dissemination to their entire membership, because you simply cannot believe that there are not people walking in these docs' offices with these complaints. They don't know what to do, so they either call them crazy or they throw them out.
Well,
and they don't do it. I don't agree that, and it's because I'm protecting my own profession, but I don't agree they're doing it because they're bad doctors or because they don't care. I think they're doing it primarily because they don't know what to do and they don't know how to deal with it. And unfortunately, in medical education, sometimes we don't do a very good job teaching doctors that it's okay to say, I don't know.
Yeah, there are two things that are driving it. One, somebody comes in with chronic fatigue syndrome. It's not a 5 or 10 minute doctor visit.
Absolutely.
And two, there's a lot of ignorance about what I can do as a primary doctor to help them. And those two conditions make these patients, these people, really hard to deal with. And a lot of doctors, as a result of that, will just say, oh, I'm not going to touch that.
Right. That's a fair comment. And I overlooked you. Please, go ahead.
Thank you. I haven't read this primer, but I think it's a great start. But I was just thinking about me sitting in the clinic trying to go through page 12 in one setting. I wouldn't be able to do that, and it would need the coordinated efforts of subspecialists to help me with several of those parts, maybe because I'm a little spoiled. But I think, I don't think primary care physicians are familiar with newly mediated hypotension, what the definition of parts, and to try to sort out, that sleep is unrefreshing without excluding all the exclusionary conditions at the first visit. So I think this is a great start, but it really needs to be simplified so that primary care providers can use this.
Okay. Susan?
Well, I mean, I wasn't going to bring this up until you raised the issue that you raised.
So it's my fault. Okay, go ahead.
Okay. Well, I think this is an important issue to raise. Who ultimately takes responsibility for taking care of chronic fatigue patients? And the problems I've encountered in my practice over the many years are, I still consider myself a CFS specialist, and I want the patient to also have a primary care doctor, especially as the population ages. I want to make sure they get their colonoscopies, their GYN care and all that, and cholesterol and et cetera. And I don't want to have to worry that some of these symptoms of the fatigue and so on are masking a silent MI or the onset of, insulin resistance and so forth. So I think the primer is good for all, internists, whether they're primary care physicians or specialists. But I think it would be good at some, perhaps, other point to have a discussion about the sort of arsenal of doctors that somebody with chronic fatigue syndrome should have. Should the primary care doctor assume responsibility for the CFS care, or and what if there isn't a CFS specialist in that person's state or city or whatever? That would be something for discussion, I think.
Well, as I said earlier today, I have people calling with some regularity. I have tried to get patients into clinics, even in my colleagues, and I can get them in the fall after, in the primary medicine and family practice clinics, family medicine clinics. I can get them in July and August when the kids have just finished their residencies, and they don't have anybody in clinic yet. But anybody, and there's nothing wrong with that. These are half these kids I trained myself or had a hand in training, and the others are I know to be quality young people and quality physicians. The problem is that in many cases, these are for exactly what you just said. It needs some of that experience to see the nuances. Let's face it, MECSF is still a diagnosis of exclusion. And you've got to make sure that they don't have any of these other illnesses that may present similarly, but number one, if they have a definitive therapy there, you can help the patient get better a whole lot quicker than what we have as a general armamentarium. And then, of course, number two is that you don't want to leave something that's really serious, like some of the ones you mentioned, untreated, because then there's a morbidity and mortality associated with that by itself. Some of these kids are not very experienced in doing that, so what they really need to be done is, and it was in one of these things that we've been reviewing today, there are very few university-based MECSF clinics, and I think that's probably one of the major areas that we should start pushing for, is a university-based clinic. There, as backwards as we are, at the University of Mississippi, that discussion is ongoing right now. We're trying to. There's several clinicians who have expressed interest in the illness, and because of I won't do things that I can't do well because it drives me crazy, and I know how much time it takes to take care of these patients correctly, and I simply don't have that time. I mean, I'm headed from here to Europe tomorrow, and I haven't been home in a week, and that sort of thing happens periodically. You can't take care of somebody with MECSF over the phone. You've got to be there for them. And I'm preaching to your choir. You two know this better than probably anybody else around the table. But there are doctors who would find this most fulfilling, most useful, and we're trying to do it to set the model for other institutions that might be willing to do it as well. But you know what the immediate question is? how are we going to support them? You know, university doctors, for the audience, it's not like it was in the old days where the state pays all the salary. The state actually pays a small percentage of the salary. We have to make our living just like everyone else through research funds or through clinical dollars. And when you take an hour with a patient, they have something called a relative value unit, or an RVU. You don't get very many RVUs for that, and you don't give much money for it. So part of it is funding, and I argue that if there's anything that some of our agencies could help fund, it would be something like that. In an education mode, we're teaching young doctors how to take care of these patients. Elaine?
Hi, I'll just step in on that. I wanted to
Just step in on it, not on it. Okay.
Raise the issue that the committee has discussed in the past, and the new members won't be familiar with this, but hopefully some of the rest of you might remember some of our discussions where we had talked about some of the models that have been out there around virtual learning networks. We had talked about the Project Echo model, and when you were discussing, you know, the extent to which this is a specialty care disease versus a primary care, and whether you can expect sort of the average primary care doctor to be able to, you know, handle what's in this primer and to know this information. One of the models that we had talked, the Project Echo model that we had looked at, was a model where you have an academic experts in an academic medical center who then have connect out to they did their initial model with hepatitis C, and were training you know, a single doctor in a rural community, a PCP, who would become sort of the community resource, the community expert on Hep C, and they would work with the academic medical center via video conferencing to present cases and get trained in that, and then they would be a resource to their community. So you might not have every PCP in that community knowing a lot about Hep C, but then they would have someone they could refer to who would be kind of the local expert. And I think we had talked a little bit about having that kind of layering where you don't need to have every PCP in the country having this level of knowledge, but maybe you could train some, you know, so that you could have access, geographical access.
I think, is that what you're going to talk about tomorrow, Beth? We don't need to go into great, but opportunities for something like that.
Yes, I'll use that as an example.
Yeah, but we're going to discuss how, in the funding discussion tomorrow, how that something like that might be possible. It's not something that the federal government originates. It's something that is an application is made and then applied to the federal government.
Right, and I'm going to discuss that tomorrow also.
Mary Ann?
I just wanted to say, at least people think I didn't like this document when I criticized the lab test. I'm really impressed that I know at least 3 of these people are really excellent primary care physicians. And that's Roz Yallow. I've been twice, visited her in New Zealand. I mean, she's just idolized there for her work in ME. And Cindy Bateman out there in Salt Lake City has a splendid clinic. And and she's a general internist. Chuck Lapp is a primary care doctor, and I think that from their perspective, they bring a great deal of expertise.
Yeah, you know, again, I think some of us are senior enough to remember when somebody who went into internal medicine was considered a high specialist, and now they're generalists, and they're not really a specialist, they're primary care doctors. But since in the old days, doctors would come out of medical school, do a rotating internship, and go into practice. That was the average physician. So if they went and did a residency, that very much was a specialist, and there was no such thing as a subspecialty unless they happened to get interested in it. But it raises an interesting question whether then should we send, if we decided we wanted to go to ACP and AAFM, American Academy of Family Medicine, and ACOG, Would we want to go to the American College of Allergy? Would we want to go to the American College of Rheumatology? Would we, how would we get the people involved? And I would say at the very least, those that are involved in immunology, their clinicians should know about that, whether it's rheumatologist or allergist immunologist. I would say that endocrinologists probably ought to know about this in great deal because, as Susan is pointing out, the primary care physician, and Ann pointed out it as well, the primary care physician can't take an hour to go through things that she or he can't answer in their office anyway because they don't have the equipment or the setup to be able to do that. But in terms of managing the illness, it still makes sense that it would be a primary care illness managed by trained and understanding primary care providers, not just compassionate, but understanding that understood the underlying. You had something, Eileen?
I did a quick read on the primer and like what I see so far, and I know that the authors of the primer have a concern that I do, and I'll mention it. This won't be the forum to fully explore it, but it's a great document, but it just exists in a vacuum unless we figure out, like you said, how to disseminate it and distribute it. And so maybe we on CFSAC can have that discussion at some point. What do we do? What can we do as a committee? Can we endorse it? Can we ask for funding to distribute it to PCPs and specialists? And would that come in the form of a recommendation, or does it get on the agenda, or what?
Well, I think you all can make recommendations like that. The one thing that we probably need to look into before are issues around copyright and
Yep.
who owns this.
I raised that issue with Lenny.
And the government has to be real careful with that.
I raised that issue with Lenny when he first started talking about this. Marty, why don't you just tell him what?
We did receive permission to duplicate the copies that you have now, but not to widely distribute it and start making copies of the copies.
Yeah,
So I had even talked to Dr. Friedberg and let him know, and Lenny. So I would also say we should be cautious about making copies for anyone else from these copies. They're aware that the committee has these copies.
This is intellectual property of the individuals who've done the work, and all of us who do this sort of stuff respect it. I have no sense that they want to be restrictive or that they want to make $1 million a piece off of this. I've never gotten that sense, but they're working through how they want to do this. So I would argue that endorsing it, and I will tell you why I'm telling you this now, just a second. Endorsing it is something very realistic that this committee could do, and commending it to the secretary for her office to determine if there is a way for it to be utilized in the context is a very real thing that we could do. And then conversations with that group. I guess he's a senior author, right? Yeah. So with Dr. Friedberg and the rest of the individuals as to what are their copyright issues. Do they want to license this? What do they want to do? Before we say we want to require or get funds to distribute it to all these, because candidly, the right way to do this, it seems to me, in today's world, is to do an online version and hit the send button, and you can send it to 1 million people like that. And for older people who want to print it, they can print it. For most of the people that would either download it to their desktop or their iPad, or even their, if they can really got good eyes, they can download it to their iPhone, and then they can use it in the context in the office setting. I'm not sure it's made it to that point of being useful where they'll flip over and use it, but it certainly will set their thinking as they begin to see the individuals, which is what this document would move forward tremendously.
There is a link actually at the end, but it doesn't work.
Oh, you already figured that out?
I tried on my phone.
Okay. Well, there you go.
Why are you talking?
Well, the
please.
copyright, it says is by the organization. And
Well, it may be
so
the.
I'm a member of that organization.
So can you speak for the organization?
No.
I'm just asking. Well, you could be president, Marianne. I don't know. That's why I asked. You think what? You could say something. Can you speak for the organization? Well, it doesn't. That does. As much as I respect you and what you say, that doesn't really help us, because it would have to be someone who could speak on behalf of the organization in an official capacity. And we'll figure out who that is.
What I'd like to do is back up Eileen, and I would make a motion. I would make a motion that we endorse this document and urge the secretary to look at ways that we can make it available to the chronic fatigue syndrome providers or primary care providers in the country.
I'd like with a friendly, oh, well, do we hear a second to that motion? Okay. I'd like to offer a friendly amendment to be more specific to her about what providers, the means to do that. Again, the argument is send it to the primary care providers and we don't provide any targets for them. It'll languish like some of the other recommendations do because they're not specific enough. So
how would you like to make it specific?
I would say to the presidents or to the presidents of the major primary care organizations in this country, and then we can smith what we mean by which ones, but there are only about a half a dozen of them.
Yeah, but I guess I'm thinking bigger than that. I would think that we look at ways to make it available to the primary care community that are going to see these patients at least at the gates, because it gives them things to think about. Even if they don't do it all, you got a differential diagnosis of all these different conditions. They can go, oh my God, I got to refer this to somebody else, and they'll find somebody.
Yeah. You know, you and I are saying the same thing, and the mechanism I'm having is that we would ask the president of the American College of Physicians for her mailing list for their membership, and ask them to send it by electronically, because electronically it doesn't cost anything to every member that's on the ACP. 93% of board-certified internists in the United States are members of the American College of Physicians.
Right. So I would accept that as a friendly amendment in that as a vehicle for doing it, we look at that, but we still have to get permission from the IACFS.
Without question.
Yeah.
And that would be part of in the motion that you made. That, to me, that is implicit in the motion, because you can't go, you're asking the secretary to explore ways to get it done. So that's implicit in the motion as you stated
Right.
it. Okay. So does everybody understand that? Would the seconder accept the friendly amendment?
Is it? So I've reviewed it and I'm in favor of that, but can I ask that everybody please review it before everybody starts nodding their head and said this is something we endorse? Can we just take a couple steps backwards before we all say, yeah, we should?
I'm fine with that. I mean, I've read it and reviewed it, so I'm good with that.
If there's a concern about that, we could table it and take it up first thing tomorrow.
Which would be fine.
But
There
how many?
There should be a concern about that. Everybody should read it before they all start nodding their heads and agreeing with us.
I don't have any problem with that.
We have a couple of hours tomorrow afternoon.
Yeah,
So
do have a couple of hours. I think that's good counsel. So with your permission, we'll just table that motion, or we can withdraw it and you can remake it tomorrow.
Not table it till tomorrow
Okay,
morning.
fine. We'll table it till tomorrow. We've got just a couple of minutes left. Let me tell you just a little bit of taste of what's going to go on tomorrow. First of all, unfortunately, I won't be leading the discussion tomorrow. I have a long-standing commitment for a meeting in Switzerland. The plane leaves at 8:30 tomorrow morning, so I have to be on that plane. From Mississippi, yeah. So I'm flying back tonight so that I can leave again tomorrow. And originally it wasn't going to be a problem, but the dates got shifted around a little bit, so it was a problem. But Nancy will run the meeting tomorrow, and things will work out just fine. What tomorrow's going to be about is two things. Number one is we're going to get more agency updates, discussions about funding opportunities and other support opportunities. And then in the afternoon, they put together a very interesting presentation by several of the MECSF organizations. Their presentations are in your packet. You can take a look at that. And then the discussion tomorrow afternoon is going to be on two things that I hope you get accomplished. One is even better idea of recommendation back to the Secretary about the definition. And with all due respect to my colleague, Dr. Belai, I don't think we have to be beholding to the CDC, but I think we have to be mindful of it. They are the organization charged with clinical epidemiology, and I think a discussion of how we can construct a win-win where we can do this so that the patients are properly served, so the new clinicians who get interested before they can see this primer and they see the toolkit that's out there, some of the specific changes we might suggest, I think that's very good. And then sort of a rehashing and a review of anything we want to talk about in terms of moving a recommendation forward to the Secretary regarding pediatric MECSF. And what's moved me the most about all this, I think one could argue clinical care is clinical care, whether they're kids or adults. But there's this unique idea about the issue as it related to educational opportunities, to the barriers that these children face, to the protections that are already built in for them, that I argue that most parents and probably most smaller school districts don't know much about. And if the school district knows about it, they may not be likely to share that information openly because it's expensive in their mindset. And then making a recommendation or recommendations, depending on what we finally come up with, to the Secretary as to how we can improve that process, the roles that other agencies that she can interact with, the role that HHS itself can play in moving that idea forward so these kids who have this illness can exercise their rights as citizens to access the services that are available to them as children with current disabilities, just like many of the others that are much better recognized. If we get those two things done and they come out of this meeting, and then when it's brought back up, the consensus of the group is still that it's a good idea to endorse this primer and send it forth to Secretary Sebelius, looking for ways to disseminate it out to the broadest market for primary care doctors. That will be an extraordinarily productive two-day meeting that we have. So with that, Mickey's big hands on the 12. We're done. Thanks everybody for being here, and we'll see you tomorrow.
Thank you.